his view of how the economy worked, if you're throwing all this money at the military, you're going to erode your civilian base of your economy. And that he felt that it was as or more important to the strength of the country than building a lot of weapons. So the question then is, was that just some quaint moment in history where Eisenhower wanted to point out this, or is it still relevant now? And unfortunately it is. We spend twice as much on the Pentagon now as we did when Eisenhower gave his speech, adjusted for inflation. And in recent years, we've gotten to the highest levels since World War II. The last few years, it's come down a bit because of the Budget Control Act. A couple of years ago, when they tried to shut down the government, the agreement was that they had to reduce the deficit by $2 trillion over 10 years. And $1 trillion of that had to come from the Pentagon. So they put caps. So instead of, if they had their way, that $1 trillion, $500 billion would be sort of the floor, and they would be going up from there. And with the caps, they're hovering at that $500 billion level, and they're chomping at the bit to try to get rid of those caps. So the arms lobby has moved heaven and earth to try to get rid of the caps, have the sort of years of untrammeled growth that they had in the last 10 years continue going forward. And they have a lot of different tools to bring to bear to try to do that. And they get to be successful, but they are not giving up. The first thing they have is what every other corporation and every other rich individual in this country has, which is they can give large donations to candidates. And the arms industry does so. I think we even have a figure somewhere. The top 5 Pentagon weapons contractors spent $53 million influence in Congress in 2013. That's why I don't need to know, it's because I've got these big banners here. The thing is, amazingly enough, that's not a lot of money compared to, say, what Wall Street does, or the pharmaceutical industry, or some other special interests. But that's because, in a sense, they don't need to. They have so many other ways to influence the government. This is just one of the techniques that they use. And they are very careful to be strategic. So, for example, the former head of the Armed Services Committee, Buck McKeon, who was a Republican from California, got $750,000 for his last 2 re-election efforts from arms companies like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and so forth. They have factories in his district, building drones, doing stealth technology. He was sort of their go-to person in Washington. And when he decided to retire, the industry was concerned, who's going to be our next person to go to bat for us and sort of take the lead in carrying water for us in Washington. And so they kind of gamed out who they thought was going to be the next chair. And there was a guy named Matt Thornberry from Texas who seemed to be the heir apparent. They immediately started shifting money towards Thornberry. They had already been giving a fair amount, but they roughly doubled their contributions to him. So that by the time he took the chair of the Armed Services Committee, they had already sort of shown their gratitude for the favors that they hoped would be coming now that he was head of the committee. John McCain, who's decided to run for re-election, it was reported in some of the insider DC papers that the first thing he did was sit down with a group of defense contractors and ask them how much they would pony up for his campaign. And now that he runs the Senate Armed Services Committee, he's likely to get quite generous contributions from those contractors. So there's the donations, which is one piece of it. Then there's lobbying. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying. And what they get for that primarily is 1,000 lobbyists in Washington, which is about almost 2 for every member of Congress. And there's staffers that we talk to who say sometimes they have to spend 20, 30% of their time just sort of fending off lobbyists from the defense industry. And given all the other lobbyists that are up there, they barely have time to think. And the only strange exception has been some of the fiscal hawks, sort of Tea Party libertarian strain, have decided the Pentagon, lo and behold, is part of government. And that if you want small government, maybe you should also put some discipline in the Pentagon. So some of those members actually don't really buy into the arguments of the industry. So they've stopped visiting some of those offices because one of the lobbyists said, well, I just go in there and they tell me how screwed up I am and I don't like that, so I'm not going to visit them anymore. So there's some funny dynamics that indicate that perhaps they don't always get their way. An aspect of the lobbying thing is the revolving door, where people come, they're working in the Pentagon, and when they retire, they go work in the arms industry, lobbying their former colleagues on behalf of their new company. And there's many, many examples of this, but just one small piece of the puzzle. It's reported by Brian Bender, who used to be at the Boston Globe, and he just tracked 3- and 4-star generals and admirals over a few-year period. What do they do when they retire? And so the 39, he looked at 34 of them went to work either for Pentagon contractors, or they set up consulting firms to do work for Pentagon contractors as consultants. So that's a pretty healthy proportion, 34 out of 39. And if you look all up and down the Pentagon, procurement officials and others, you're probably talking hundreds or maybe even thousands of these people who yearly go into that sector. And in addition to them having a lot of clout with their former colleagues, it affects them while they're in government. Because if you're negotiating a contract with somebody and you're trying to decide how tough to be on them, and you're hoping to go work for them in a couple of years, you tend to cut them a little slack. Because you make a lot more working at a defense contractor than you make as a general. Generals do fine, by the way, but it's multiples more. So it affects the process in various different ways. Then, probably the biggest leverage that the industry has is the jobs argument. Because when you spend $500 billion, it employs a lot of people. And here in New Hampshire, they have BAE, there's people working at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, there's other companies around the state, and other states are even more dependent on Pentagon spending, places like Connecticut. So if there's a weapon system like the F-35, which is a new fighter plane, it's the most expensive weapons program the Pentagon has ever undertaken, it's had a lot of problems. It can't really do most of the things it's supposed to do. It can't communicate with troops on the ground. It's got this high-tech helmet that's supposed to tell the pilot what's going on, and the helmet's been having false positives, shooting at things that aren't there. It can't communicate well with other aircraft. It can't really locate radar so well, but yet the money keeps flowing. And then there's the question of what is it really for? The wars that the United States has fought, all of which I've opposed over these last years, have been against adversaries often didn't have air forces, much less anti-aircraft. And the big argument that they have given is, well, what about when if we have to go to war with China? Well, if we have to go to war with China, and we're both nuclear-armed powers, the last thing I'm worried about is whether the fighter plane is good enough. I'm worried about whether we're going to be here at the end of that process. So I think that to sell that kind of plane, which is not performing well, which has questionable need in the first place, the jobs argument has been their sort of strong suit. And so Lockheed Martin has a little interactive map that shows you their claim of how many jobs there are in each state, how much economic activity in each state from building this plane. And they claim they have activity in 46 states, it creates 125,000 jobs, and therefore case closed. You can't vote against it. But in fact, I dug into their numbers a little bit, and they kind of cooked them out of thin air. I asked them, where did you get these from? Did you do a study or something? And the answer was no. They had a little article from 1996 about what was the effect of Boeing in Washington State, which was the biggest employer in the state, and they had a ripple effect along the state. And so they were comparing spending in 1996 on a particular project of Boeing's to what would happen now in the entire country spending on this fighter plane. So the answer was they just kind of picked a number that they liked, and the number they liked was 125,000. They also said, well, it's going to be all over the country. In fact, most of the contracts are in California and Texas, and a lot of them are overseas, because when they sell the plane, they sell some of the production rights. So there's going to be an assembly plant in Italy and possibly one in Japan. We actually found more overseas contractors involved in the project than American contractors. So there's fewer jobs, there are fewer places, many of them are overseas. But even given all that, a job is a job. And they're industrial jobs, they're union jobs, in places where there's not a lot of other good employment to be had, the jobs argument still has a strong pull. And then there's sort of little funny stories that kind of show what kind of lengths the contractors will go to just make members of Congress feel good about that. And for example, there was this Representative Jack Murtha, the late Jack Murtha, who was from Pennsylvania, a Democrat. He was known as the king of pork barrel politics because he was so good at bringing contractors into his district. And his wife's favorite charity was the Johnstown, Pennsylvania Symphony Orchestra, which has become one of the best financed symphony orchestras in the world because it gets checks every year from Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman and Boeing. They come to the openings and clink champagne glasses with people from the community. And they probably do like classical music, for all I know. But that's not why they're doing it. They were doing it because it brought them closer to Jack Murtha. And it was almost better in a way than a campaign contribution. Because they could spend as much as they wanted. It sort of burnished his ego. It was good for his family. It was almost as good as just handing him some money in a paper bag. So there was that example. When Trent Lott from Mississippi headed the Senate Appropriations Committee, the University of Mississippi set up the Trent Lott Leadership Institute in his honor. And the first company to step forward to write a check was Lockheed Martin. And they handed over $1 million check to help set up that institute. Buck McKeon, who I mentioned, his wife decided to run for the state legislature in California because she was annoyed that she had to pay 5 cents for a plastic bag at the supermarket. And so she wanted to get rid of that. And so she was running for the state legislature, and that was her only campaign plank. So suddenly she developed this huge war chest because all these contractors were funding this state legislative race. And a reporter asked the Lockheed Martin representative, what's going on here? And I said, oh, we've suddenly taken a great interest in statewide issues around the country. And they wouldn't even admit that it was to exert influence with McKeon, which of course was laughable. So there's things like that that are also done. So it's sort of like the money just looks for ways to operate and to exert influence. And of course, those things may be a little less necessary now with Citizens United because corporate money is pretty unlimited. I mean, you can spend it to defeat somebody, certainly. And you can also spend it to elect somebody. And often we don't even know where the money's coming from. So, maybe some of these little things they're doing are almost quaint in this era of endless money. So that's the depressing part of my presentation. And then the question becomes, what can we do about it? And I think there are some vulnerabilities, even of a giant lobbying complex like the military-industrial complex. First of all, they're not necessarily shoulder to shoulder unless they're all getting what they want. So for example, when there's been a lid on Pentagon spending, such as it is, even at this high level, the companies tend to fight each other. Because, for example, the Pentagon wants to spend $1 trillion on nuclear weapons over the next 3 decades to build a new ballistic missile submarine, and new bombers, and new warheads, and new factories for warheads, all at a time when we have nuclear overkill. And in order to do this, for example, the ballistic missile submarines are going to cost $8 to $12 billion per submarine. And the Navy's shipbuilding budget, such as it is projected, it would eat up half to 2/3 of the budget, which means fewer aircraft carriers, fewer destroyers. So there's a fight among the contractors who build for the Navy about which of those things should be built. And so they're spending some of that campaign money and some of that lobbying money to fight each other, which is better than spending it to fight us. There's also been cases like Lockheed Martin wanted to preserve the F-22 fighter, which was the most expensive fighter plane by unit cost that the Pentagon had ever built. And at a certain point, the Pentagon leadership said, enough already. We've spent tens of billions of dollars on this thing, and it's time to stop and move on. But Lockheed Martin disagreed, and the Air Force disagreed. And so they decided to mount a campaign to, they called it Save the Raptor, because the plane's nickname was the Raptor. And So the kind of